Hello and thanks for joining us. The future is female. That's the rallying cry. But today, as part of Women's History Month, we're looking to the past with two female writers who have created some remarkable female characters in their delightful historical novels. I'm joined by Sarah Jane Stratford, who's the author of Red Letter Days, and Imogen Hermes Gower, whose debut novel is called The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Now, you've both created stories that exist in the past. Sarah Jane, Red Letter Days follows two 30-something women as they navigate the minefield that was America's hunt for communists while still striving to make it as television writers in the 1950s. This really is somewhat overlooked as a moment in history. Why did you choose this moment?
Exactly for that reason, that it is overlooked and it's very important. I got the idea in 2016, so it was just after the election in the States. There was already a lot of talk about clamping down on speech and on civil liberties. And it got me thinking about times in the past when similar things had occurred, and what did we do and how did people push back? How did people resist? In particular, I started thinking about women because to the extent that people know about the communist witch hunts in the States, they maybe know about the men. There was the famous group, the Hollywood 10, who were persecuted. I started digging to see, what women were involved. And there was quite an exciting story to be found. So that's what I wrote.
And Imogen, your story plunges readers into the vibrant world of Georgian London in the late 18th century. We meet the delightful Angelica Neal, a courtesan. Describe the story.
My story, it has two main protagonists who eventually come together. They're Jonah Hancock, who is a merchant, and Angelica Neal, a high-class courtesan. And she is kind of down on her luck. She has been bereaved of a previous man who was keeping her, and she's now looking for somebody else and back in the centre of London. Angelica Neal and Mr. Hancock are brought together by his discovery of what he believes to be a real mermaid, which he then starts to display around London, and which brings him into her orbit. What struck me about researching it was the confluence of mercantile lives and the lives of these women who sold sex to keep themselves going. I wanted to look at human relationships through a financial lens and also through this kind of sleight of hand and fantasy.
And both of you were inspired by real people and events. Sarah Jane, one of the characters in your book was based on a real TV series creator. Tell us more.
Yes, so it's this extraordinary woman, Hannah Weinstein. I changed her name in the book because I changed her character quite a bit, but she was someone who escaped the States early, and so she wasn't actually blacklisted. And when she sought refuge in London, and she began a production house and produced this television series, The Adventures of Robin Hood. And she made it a point to hire only blacklisted writers, who, of course, had to write under pseudonyms. They wrote stories that were all very focused on social justice. So even though they were all medieval and they were great adventures, it was still driving home the point of social justice, of the need for a free and fair society, the need for civil liberties, the need for equality.
And in both books, we see women's ability to rise above their circumstances, whatever they may be, and thrive. Imogen, why did this interest you?
Always through my writing, I've been really particularly interested in exploring worlds without feminism. That I think growing up in the generation that I have, in the part of the world that I have, I've always felt that it's a given that I, as a woman, should be able to pursue certain professions, to own my own money, this kind of thing. There is a level of security to me that many other women in the world now and in the past don't enjoy. And I felt that it was a challenge to myself to try and inhabit that mindset and not to patronize it. How a person might climb the ladder socially and make themselves safe in a world where there really wasn't a safety net for them beyond the care of men. The context of these high-class brothels, which were called nunneries, in 18th century London, was a really interesting little lens to look at that through, how women were seizing security and trying to make themselves safe, and how long that safety actually lasts for, and how precarious it is.
And part of me felt like the women in your novel, set in the 18th century, were freer than the characters in Red Letter Days in the 1950s. Hannah, your main character, Sarah Jane, is constantly getting scolded by her husband. She's being encouraged to dress a certain way. Do you think that could be possible, that they were actually freer in the 18th century than in the 1950s?
To a certain extent, it's perception, but certainly until very recently, and people would argue not, because it's still true, being married does place a level of pressure upon you. If she had a certain amount of financial agency, could have some freedom in a way that a married woman might not.
And Imogen, in your book, we see life inside a brothel. Is a woman's subjection, her second-class status in society, more evident in a brothel or in a marriage, do you think?
Well, actually, there were many women and men in the 18th century who were saying they were one and the same thing. Like Henry Fielding is saying that in the middle of the 18th century, that like marriage is legalized prostitution. It's a transaction that women have to engage in order to achieve a certain level of status and social security. These high-class courtesans were able to spend time with men in ways that those men's wives were not able to, that they were trained to be able to have certain conversations, to take interest in politics, to stay up all night drinking with men and having fun. An aristocratic woman would have been actively discouraged from doing that. But then if you're in the street, those women who spent all night with your husband are going to be snubbed and treated as if they're completely invisible.
Very interesting subjects that you're both raising in your books. Imogen, you've been acclaimed for questing a new wave of feminist fiction that brings the complex lives of historical women out of the shadows. Is bringing women's stories to the forefront something that you set out to do?
You know, you go to castles and things and you see the kitchens or the sculleries and stuff, but there's no elaboration on who was doing that and what their lives were like. I wanted to find the working class people and the women and the people of colour. Like they were all there and they were alive, but I didn't know anything about them. So I think I didn't set out with any political agenda. It was more a personal question. The way that we consume history still feels quite focused on things that we don't see ordinary people in. And that was my interest in looking at these women.
And Sarah Jane, I wanted to ask you, which women writers have most influenced your fiction?
Margaret Atwood, Jane Austen, more recently, Hilary Mantel. I love how people are just telling so many different stories in so many different ways. Margaret Atwood, going a slightly darker direction. And with Hilary Mantel, I mean, obviously the Wolf Hall series, yes, it's about a man, but to a certain extent, I'm not sure a woman would have been accepted writing something like that, not even so terribly long ago. Just echoing a lot of what Imogen said, there's a point of, there's people who feel like, oh, well, but, how many important women have there been really? But who has been allowed to write history? And who has even been in a position of determining, what is acceptable for history, for a curriculum, who is allowed to have a statue of themselves? I mean, I think it's true that still only 3% of the statues in the UK are of women. You can't be it if you can't see it.
Imogen, if you could pick one woman from history to put in every high school history textbook, who would it be?
I would choose Dorothea Jordan. She was a comic actress in the late 18th into the 19th century. She was incredibly famous. Jane Austen saw her and wrote about her. She spent 20 years acting incredible parts, and she ended up in a relationship with the Duke of Clarence, who eventually became King William IV and had 10 children with him. But the Duke of Clarence had to end their relationship because he needed to marry a princess, because none of he and his siblings had produced any heirs to the throne. She didn't have access to their children anymore. The youngest was 4 years old, and her condition of being able to see them was to quit the stage, but she couldn't do it because she couldn't afford to support herself any other way. She died a few years later in France, having not seen them again, and saying that she had given up hope because she was heartbroken at knowing she would not see her children again. In terms of having her in a textbook, there would be so much there to talk about the 18th century world and how they regard women, and as well as doing her justice for being quite an extraordinary person.
Just before we go, we always ask for our guests cultural pick of the moment. Sarah Jane, what have you chosen?
10%. It's so funny. And it's so clever. It's really one of the best written and acted things I've seen in just ages. It really feels like such a love letter to art, to the people who make art, to cinema, theater, television, even though it's about the agents. But, without agents, we wouldn't get very far.
I have chosen something completely different. I've chosen the Artemisia Gentileschi exhibition, which is at the National Gallery, which opened last year, and I didn't get to go and see it because of the pandemic. And it's always been my dream to see a collection of her paintings together and have a kind of overview of her, because she was an artist during the 16th century. She was involved in a rape trial when she was 17 years old, and that seems to have influenced quite a lot of her work after that, of this experience of sexual violence. And she produced some extraordinary masterpieces of art, and it's something I would love to see in a room together. I don't think that I will, but it's online.
Imogen and Sarah Jane, thank you so much for joining us. Both of your books are being translated into French: Red Letter Days and The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock. Thanks for your company. See you next time.
An ally of Zambia since its independence, China is now also its main creditor. Chinese expats and investors dominate huge swathes of the economy.
Here we're investor, we make some money, but we also considering how the situation for our Zambia people.
Chinese influence is so great, some say it looks like new colonialism.
The reality now is that you are safer being Chinese in Zambia than being in Zambia.
我们需要他们，他们也需要我们。
An investigation into the heart of Chinese Africa in Reporters Plus on France 24 and France24.com.